Welcome to the Woven Energy Podcast with me, Joseph Sikora, and Damon Smith, and we are here to talk about shamanism from the ground up. And it's been a while. I'm usually spend a bit of time planning these episodes out, but I haven't had a chance to do that today, so it's going to be a bit off the cuff. But Damon, it's been a while, hasn't it?
Yes, indeed. We've both been very, very busy. Yeah,
crazy busy. We were talking about the 8 trigrams before. We had a few episodes on the 8 trigrams, which we are going to continue with, aren't we? At some point, but Today's main theme is Buddhism. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we said we would do this. I don't know, as a precursor to talking specifically about Mongolian Buddhism and I guess Tibetan Buddhism, which is very closely related.
Yeah. Why do we want to talk about Buddhism at all?
Well, it's a good question. You know, what we've said is that shamanism, when human beings became civilized, hid itself within various mainstream religions as a kind of self-protection mechanism. One of those religions was Buddhism. And I also think that in terms of how Westerners perceive things from the Far East, there are a number of assumptions that are made. For instance, it's very rarely I've seen a Westerner with negative opinions about Buddhism, for instance.
I was about to say the same thing, and my impression is with people, when you talk about exoteric religions, you know, it's like Christianity and stuff, people don't tend to lump Buddhism in with that, and they tend to talk about it as in terms of, oh, it's all spiritual, it's more spirituality based, and they have these strange terms for it.
Yes, and I think that knowing where Buddhism came from and understanding really what it's about from a shamanistic perspective is important. You know, what we said is we try to talk about shamanism, and we don't try to tie it down very much to. We talked about particular peoples. We talked about the Evenki people and the Mongolian Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism, and Mongolian shamanism and Japanese shamanism, which are closely related to Mongolian Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism, and it's very, very difficult in this day and age, unless you are interested in, the very small number, tiny, vanishingly small number of hunter-gatherer peoples who are still around in the world today. It's very, very hard to talk about shamanism in a pure sense because it's been mixed in with all of these other traditions. And I think understanding something about those traditions is useful, not in a positive way, but in a negative way. And sort of, if you subtract, for instance, if you were to subtract Mongolian Buddhism from Mongolian shamanism, then you would end up with a pretty pure form of shamanism. So it's more like that kind of a subtraction exercise. That's the reason, from a shamanist's point of view, to understand it, rather than that learning Buddhism is in some way going to help you with your shamanism. You know, we've said meditation that doesn't involve imagination can be a bit helpful when you start off. Yeah. But it's just really to give a different perspective. What kind of a thing is it that shamanism embedded itself within? Now, you've got to remember that in terms of the Far East, the major tradition of the Far East that shamanism embedded itself within was Buddhism. Buddhism is in all of those places where, not all of the places, but a lot of the places where shamanism is in the Far East. So Japan, a major Buddhist country to this day, Thailand, China until very recent times was the world's main Buddhist country, but there was a lot of survival of shamanism in China, still is to a tiny extent.
What happened to Buddhism in China? Was it suppressed?
Communism happened to Buddhism in China. So if you think about China,
question, really.
China is a very, historically has been a very insular country. There have been time periods part of the Song dynasty, for instance, and part of the Ming dynasty when it was an outward-looking nation, and and then very early on as well, were engaged with the other parts of the world in trade in an active and enthusiastic way. But for the vast majority of China's incredibly long history, it's been quite an insular country, and a lot of the traditions that China has had have grown. By its very nature, they've grown up inside China, endemically,
with little outside influence.
Yes, but there are two major exceptions to that. Two major exceptions to that, in terms of outside influence coming into China and having a major impact on Chinese society. One of those exceptions is Buddhism, and the other one is communism. And there really aren't very many more. That are anything on like that scale. If you think about the massive impact that communism's had on China, if you look at the whole of history, that's tiny compared to the amount of impact that Buddhism's had on China. Because you've got to remember, really, before Buddhism arrived, now we're talking about the first Buddhists arrived in China around the 1st century AD. But it really took off several hundred years later than that, or a few hundred years later than that, in a period after the fall of the Han Dynasty. You can think of the Han Dynasty. Probably everybody's heard of the Han Dynasty. It's really famous. And if you ask Chinese people about their various dynasties, it's all like Han's number 1 and Tang's number 2, or vice versa. But it's a dynasty that's treated with a lot of respect in China. Now, if you want to think of the time period of the Han, it's very, very easy to remember because it's virtually a carbon copy of the Roman Empire in Europe. The same time period, the same kind of level of domination of its society, and actually the Han was slightly bigger than the Roman Empire, but on the same kind of scale. So that's the Han was a period of internal stability within China. What effect it had on other peoples is a different matter, but it was a period of internal stability.
And for the ignorant among us like myself, what kind of time period is this?
So this is sort of from it crosses the 0 BC AD time barrier about 400 years over that time period, just like the Roman Empire. Right. So I'll tell you what, I'll get the exact dates up.
Buddhism was the main sort of societal normal way of being.
Not in the Han. Not in the Han. No, it was the fall of the Han that. Buddhism was there in the Han. So the time period, as I said, I actually nailed it. I said it's about 400 years spaced either side of 0 AD. It's actually 206 BC to 220 AD. There you are. So my memory's not as bad as I thought it was, yeah. Buddhism did appear in China during the Han. The first, I guess you would say, Buddhist monks, or whatever you want to call them, Buddhist emissaries, appeared in China during that time period. But no, it was actually the fall of the Han that made Buddhism popular. I think we talked previously about the fall of the Shang and the Zhou dynasties, and then there was a sort of period of turbulence within China, a kind of warring states period, if you like, before... and the spring and autumn period, which gave rise to a lot of the philosophies that
we haven't really talked much about China. We've done a lot on Japan and a bits and pieces on Mongolia.
I think we did do it. We talked about Confucianism, for instance, didn't we? So Confucianism appeared originally during that period of turbulence, and so did Taoism, really, in terms of it becoming a factor of Chinese life, if you like. And so that was the first period of instability. And then we had the Qin dynasty reunified China. It didn't last very long. But then the Han dynasty did last a long time, as with China fairly unified. And then that collapsed, and there was another period of instability with lots of different dynasties, things like the former Qin, confusingly named former Qin, and the Northern Wei, and various dynasties of this type. Yeah. This second period of instability in dynastic China, this is the one in which Buddhism started to take off. And a few of those kingdoms after the fall of the Han, particularly the former Qin and the Northern Wei, those guys, the leadership of those, you can call them dynasties. I mean, they didn't control the whole of China like the Han had. They were just little bits of China. Probably quite large by our standards, but China's a big place. They became their leadership became very interested in Buddhism and actively sought out Buddhist teachers, and actually the story goes, I mean, how true this is or not, I don't know, but the story goes that the leadership of the former Qin, who not to be confused with the Qin dynasty, just a confusingly named dynasty, they started to conquer to the west in order to find Buddhist experts on what they call the Dharma. The Dharma is the teachings of the Buddha, the law of the Buddha, L-O-R-E, if you like. And they started to conquer areas of territory to the west of China, leading to Chinese expansion. China wasn't as big in those days as it is today, leading to Chinese expansion. In order to do that, they had to put military people out to the west. And
when you say west in relation to China, are you talking like India?
I'm talking about parts in the west of modern China, but it wasn't China in those days, if you see what I mean. That's what I'm talking about, yeah. And so putting that military in had an unexpected knock-on effect, because they had to pay those guys and all the officials and bureaucrats and all that kind of thing and support them and all that kind of stuff. That pushed a lot of wealth and goods into the west of China, and they came in contact with traders from further to the west, and they started trading with them, and then those traders traded further west, and they traded further west, and they traded further west, and they went right through the Middle East, and they ended up, the Han were involved in this as well. This as well. They ended up actually connecting their ancient capital Chang'an, which is basically modern day Xi'an, with the Roman Empire, or what was left of the Roman Empire, the remains of the Roman Empire, and I guess it was still Roman Empire in those days, because Roman Empire survived longer than 220 AD, and they started trading, and so this is the silks and porcelain and all those kind of Chinese artifacts. They started trading them. As far as as a Roman citizen, you're going into your local market and buying expensive silks. I guess you'd have to be a wealthy Roman citizen, buying expensive silks from China. You probably think that at the far end of what became known as the Silk Road, China's also similarly placed to you. They're trying to trade Roman goods. They're trying to trade in Roman goods, and you've got this very long distance exchange going on in what became known as the Silk Roads. But of course, the Chinese weren't thinking about it like that at all. They were just trying to conquer territories to the west of China partly in order to find these Buddhist experts, these Buddhist preachers, and bring them back into China so they could teach people the Dharma. Quite interesting, and that'll give you an insight into Chinese culture as a whole and its view. It's quite insular view from the Roman Empire end, long distance trade, which became known as the Silk Road, and I guess from the European end, and from China's end, we're just funding our soldiers to go out and conquer new areas of Chinese territory, in order to bring back expertise. I don't think they needed the wealth so much. They were pretty wealthy. So that's pretty much what happened, and it was during the period immediately following the Han that Buddhism started to take off, because obviously they had these preachers going around. China, and Buddhist preachers, and Buddhism, like all successful exoteric traditions, baseline traditions, is very, very good at sucking people in, civilized people in. And Buddhism did in China exactly what Christianity did around the same time in Europe. So
well, it's interesting you say like all exoteric religions. with Buddhism, because I think people have I was about to say misconception, but a conception, shall we say, that Buddhism is an access point to the more spiritual area of shamanism and spirituality.
Yes, that's right. That there's a lot of people feel that there's some kind of link there, and I guess there is, but I would say that link is much more to do with shamanism having post-embedded itself within Buddhism than it has anything to do with the Buddhist tradition itself. The Buddhist tradition itself is very, very baseline tradition. It's based on baseline premises. It's fundamentally based on the philosophical idea that life is about suffering. And that is that's about as far away from shamanism as you can possibly get.
So when you say this is at the heart and core of Buddhism, are we talking about Buddhism of this day, this age?
Yes,
or particular
Buddhism.
branches of Buddhism? I'm just trying to get a clear idea of
what
that Buddhism means.
Yeah, so Buddhism itself started off a lot earlier than this. It started off in about 400, 500, between 400 and 500 BC.
And am I correct in thinking this came from India? This is an offshoot of Hinduism,
but it was northern India. It was, again, India's borders were different, and there was lots of small kingdoms. And
very fluid, were they? It's still
but
are,
yes,
really.
the long and the short of it is yes. It also would have been in the area of countries like Nepal and places like that, what we would call those sort of countries now, but which would be part of conceptual India in those days. But Buddhism today is seen, obviously, because of its massive history. I mean, it was a fairly substantially longer history, about 400, 500 years longer than Christianity, for instance. It's embedded itself and it's given itself a strong presence, but in terms of its origins, Brahmanism, or what became Brahmanism, it's really, in terms of its philosophy, it's really a branch of that, and it's kind of, there are certain things, the reason I call it baseline tradition, there are certain things within Buddhism that are held to be self-evidently true, and one of the major foundational parts of that comes from the Brahmin tradition, if you want to call it the Indian tradition.
Yeah, well, Brahmins were the intellectuals, weren't they? They were the high high thinkers of the day.
Became so, but I mean, became so. But the point I'm trying to make is that to those guys, the historical Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, the historical Buddha was deeply steeped in that tradition. And a fundamental part of that tradition is this idea of reincarnation and things like ideas like karma. So what I'm saying is that if Buddhism hadn't become fabulously successful, as it has done, in the same way that Christianity hadn't become fabulously successful, then Buddhism would probably be viewed as a if there weren't many Buddhist followers in the world, or Buddhist practitioners in the world, it would be seen as a small fringy offshoot of Brahmanism, in the same way that Christianity in the same situation would be seen as a small fringy offshoot of Judaism. Very much the same kind of thing. It's just the fact that they were so exoteric that they became, and if you want to think of it another way,
a force unto themselves.
Yeah, that they were particularly exoteric branches of these things, and that's why they became so fabulously successful. We said before that the exoteric religions, they target the leadership of countries. That's how they manage to turn countries en masse. They're not stupid enough to go out and try and convert, a country like China over to Buddhism by talking to millions and millions of lay people. They target the leadership, and that's what they did, and very, very successfully. And as I said, they became the major external tradition that's influenced China. Very, very, it's an exceptional thing, because China is so insular. For an external tradition to come in and have such a huge impact on a culture is very, very rare and unusual. And so basically,
it spreads, doesn't it? It's like, I remember in the very first episode of the Woven Energy podcast when we were talking about how shamanism, the difference between shamanism and a typical religion would be shamanism's almost like somebody's taken a pepper pot and sprinkled it over the world.
Yeah.
Whereas religion spreads from a point.
It's patches, isn't it? It's a bit like bacteria on a petri dish.
I was about to say bacteria, but I was
yeah. So I mean, Buddhism is a great tradition, one of the world's great traditions, and I don't want to belittle the Buddhist achievement because as a shamanist, it's usually we view these things as hiding places. We view them as a sort of cloth that you put over the top of something when you don't want somebody to see it.
So there's this new tent emerging called Buddhism, where all these exotericists are thinking, ooh. Yeah. There's somewhere new we can hide all our knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you're into art, for instance, if art is one of your interests, then the Buddhist art tradition will keep just studying the Buddhist art tradition would keep you happy for several lifetimes, I suspect, because these traditions they gain because they can become powerful and they get powerful advocates. That's what happened in China. Very high-ranking people started actively pushing Buddhism because very often they were genuine Buddhist converts, and those are the people who can afford to commission great artworks and this type of thing. And so sorry,
go on. Sorry.
All I was going to say is that this tradition of Buddhism, although it came from India, I really think of it as something that was built by China. China at one time had more Buddhists than the rest of the world put together, and arguably in terms of the cultural attitudes of the Chinese people still does. They probably, if you did a survey, most of them would say they weren't Buddhists because they're not religiously Buddhist, but attitudinally there is still a strong influence of Buddhism in China. Yeah. And I can be even more controversial and say I can see major Buddhist influence on Chinese communism, and I guess I could say that the thing that makes Chinese communism different, for instance, from Soviet communism, are two things. One's the imperial tradition, which it absorbed, with things like Mao Zedong, perhaps Deng Xiaoping, actually effect becoming emperors of China in all but name. And the other one is in terms of it is Buddhism, effectively, in terms of the attitudes. The idea of communism in Russia, in Soviet Russia, was all about the proletariat rising up and overthrowing the powers that be. In Marxist-Leninist theory, it was the workers who were going to do that. They were the ones among the ordinary, the common people, who had achieved a level of sophistication. The workers in the factories and what have you, the industrialized city-based workers. It was those guys who were going to rise up and overthrow the ruling power, which is what effectively happened in the Soviet Union, or Russia, which became the Soviet Union. And that's pretty much the model for most of the countries that became communist around following the initial Soviet. The initial establishment of Russia as a communist country, but of course that's not what happened in China. What happened in China was there was that view in China, and it was very among the communists in China there was that view, but it was pretty unsuccessful.
When you say that view, you're talking about Marxist-Leninist,
about the factory workers. Workers, in inverted commas, being the ones who overthrow the ruling powers. Of course, the ones who overthrew the ruling powers in Chinese communism were the common people out in the countryside. It was the farmers, Effectively, it was the supposedly uneducated, unsophisticated people that were leveraged in establishment of the success of Chinese communism, and that initial division between the sort of Russian style communists and the uniquely Chinese communists. If you look at in terms of the attitude of being evangelical with the people out in the countryside, that is something that the Buddhist tradition had done with its monasteries and what have you for a couple of thousand years in China. And so Mao and that part of the communist movement within China effectively replicated that quite successfully. And so effectively, I think Buddhism still does have a lot of influence on China. And the knock-on effect is because China was such a powerful country for a long period of time, and it effectively ended up being the Zhongguo, as they call it in China, the central kingdom, the central country of the world as they saw it, but as we would see it, the Far East. All these other nations at various times gave them tribute. Korea and Japan during a certain time period, and took a lot of influence from China. So of course, those guys got Buddhism as well. And of course, Southeast Asia is still very, very strongly Buddhist in many ways. So major success. So it is an important thing to know about. I guess coming back to the point about, what is it really about? It's ultimately about suffering and how to relieve it. As I said, this is why Buddhism took off in this, even though Buddhism arrived during a period of stability, it didn't become popular until a period of instability came along, when everybody was indeed suffering. And Buddhism's got this great message about suffering. Life's about suffering, but something can be done about it, because suffering ultimately arises from desire. So if you quash desire, then you quash suffering. This is effectively the core of Buddhist philosophy.
Now we're getting into the territory of warnings for Buddhism, aren't we? Because let's say I'm listening to this podcast, I'm new to shamanism, I'm getting excited, I want to learn shamanism. I've got all these different things shouting at me, and there's this new shiny little object called Buddhism, and I might choose to explore it. This is the stuff that we need to be aware of, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in that place, I think you're in a minority, though. I would suspect most people in the West know way more about Buddhism than they know about shamanism. That's my experience. But if you're in that place, I would say, that's a good starting point.
Okay, the other way around then.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm a Buddhist and I'm steeped in Buddhist tradition.
Yeah,
and I'm like, okay, I want to shed all that, and I want to get into the good stuff, the real stuff.
Oh, well, if that's true, but if you were a long-term Buddhist and you are steeped in Buddhist tradition, I think you've already turned the podcast off by this point, and you're not listening.
I'm trying hard here, David.
So in terms of, I understand what you're asking. So in terms of, but really, I'm not trying to criticize Buddhism for the sake of it. It's just so that you can understand the difference between shamanism and Buddhism, and I can explain where that confusion arises. There are various ways. We've talked a lot about Chilisty, right?
Episodes 7, 8, and 9.
I don't think anybody could criticize us on not covering Chilisty, at least on a baseline level on this podcast. Yeah. So, in terms of Chilisty, there are various models, various analogies that are used in describing Chilisty, and Bhagavad Gita, the empty vessel is a great one. That's the one I like. The cup, the chalice, the Holy Grail, all that kind of stuff. That's the one I like, yeah. But there is another one which revolves around fire. And I think that one of the things that people have noticed is that there's in the West, there's an ancient Greek philosopher called Heraclitus, and he talked about fire a lot. And, the analogy that you empty your cup, you can think of the human spirit on various levels. So, for instance, the Chinese use various different words to talk about the human spirit. They use Xin, which is like a deeper level of spirit, and then they use Yi, which is more like the intention, what the spirit gives rise to. And I think we've said that distinction, the intention, in exotericism, when we become very baseline, we start to take active control of that ourselves, and it's not really arising from our internal spirit as it would in shamanism, but it's arising from our deepest spirit. It's arising from our logic, from our strategy, from our culture, from our learned behavior, from what we've described as the miasma on these podcasts. And the fire analogy, rather than the chalice analogy, where you quash this internal fire, if that internal fire is a representation of if that internal fire is taken as a representation of the miasma generated intention within yourself, then that fire, quashing that fire, is a good analogy for chillicity. The problem comes when people take that internal fire not as an analogy for miasma generated intent, but instead for the soul, for the underlying spirit, the thing that ultimately gives rise to the active qualities within life, and to the ability of a shaman to integrate with nature in a very, very intimate and extensive way. And so this analogy of the fire, I think, gives rise to a lot of this confusion, because when you quash the miasma generated intent, the miasma generated strategy, when you quash that allows you to extend outwards into the world, and for the world to enter into you, like filling up a cup. But if you try to quash the underlying desire, if you want to think in scientific terms, if you try and actively quash your limbic system, that is cutting yourself off from nature. And so, do you follow what I mean? So it depends what you're using that fire for. But this analogy of fire is used a lot in Buddhism, because
it's the going up into the mountain on your own for 20 years and sitting and facing the wall and meditating and doing absolutely nothing for 20 effing years. It's that, isn't it?
Possibly. That's probably quite an extreme example, mate. But yeah, some people do that. But my point is, what are you doing in that meditation? Are you trying to quash desire? Because Buddhism's has two underlying premises. One that arguably came from the Buddha, which is that the life's about suffering, and the desire is the root of suffering. And if you manage to quash desire, or some people call it attachment, if you manage to quash that, then you can break out of the cycle of samsara. The point with that quashing is it's all based on that old Brahman intuition, which is about rebirth. It's held to be self-evidently true that you're going to be reborn as something else. And this is where karma comes into Buddhism. You're going to be reborn if you're not good, if you're not good in a sense of, what a Buddhist community would view as being well behaved. You could come back as a gnat or a cockroach or something like that, because the ultimate goal of Buddhism is to achieve nirvana. And nirvana is about breaking out of that cycle of rebirth. What the Buddha was concerned with, the historical Buddha was concerned with, was, we keep getting reborn, How are we going to put a stop to this? And he felt that if people become...
That old problem. Oh dear.
Yeah, exactly.
Keep getting reborn.
It'd be nice.
Let's come up with a solution to this strange problem.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And so, how do you do that? There are many ways to be a Buddhist. I mean, one way to be a Buddhist is to try and there's positive and negative karma. It's just to try and collect lots and lots of positive karma, so you come back as something nice. Yeah. And to avoid negative karma, so you don't come back as a cockroach. Basically, that's one way to be a Buddhist. That you could think of that as a lay Buddhist, but another way to become a Buddhist is part of that old Indian ascetic tradition, where you literally try to cut off all of your attachment from the world, and quash the internal fire, because that internal fire is what drives. They believe that internal fire is what drives that ongoing cycle of rebirth. And you therefore reach a state of nirvana where you are cut off from all of that, and therefore you don't get reborn. And I mean, obviously, another thing we should say about Buddhism is that, like all exoteric traditions, you'll be hard-pressed to find two Buddhists who exactly agree on what Buddhism is. So, there may be some people, some open-minded Buddhists still listening to the podcast thinking, that's not exactly right. My point is, I'm giving I've spent decades working with people who are Japanese Buddhists, decades and decades, and are heavily involved in that tradition. What I'm really giving an impression of is what the average person, the world over, who's involved in Buddhism believes. And just like the average person the world over, what they believe about Christianity is not the same as a sophisticated theologist would believe about Christianity. This is the same in Buddhism as well. Yeah. So I'm trying to give an average position. Yeah. So in terms of those two different paths to being a Buddhist, actually, in terms of the vast majority of people in the world, there'd be most lay Buddhists would be concerned with more with the karma kind of thing than breaking out there, because you also get in Buddhism, you get this "we're not worthy" kind of thing. Zen, for instance, a lot of involvement with Zen, which is a Chinese school of Buddhism. Called Chan, but it became popular in Japan.
I always associate Zen with mindfulness and just meditation in general.
Yeah,
I could have that wrong.
Because you're a Westerner, mate. I mean, Zen is a tradition that stresses meditation and various other techniques that you could say have some sort of shamanic origin. So you could say that the Chan Zen tradition has some shamanism embedded in it. That's obviously that's a retrofit as far as I'm concerned. It wasn't there originally. Shamanists have hidden their stuff within Zen, but in terms of the point I was making in terms of the social dimension of that, Western adherents of Zen, most of the Westerners who I've met who are into Zen, they're very, very much into this meditation stuff and all that kind of stuff. What I've seen in the Far East is that they say they're into that, but actually seniority within Zen tradition, within Zen institutions, and how enlightened you are perceived to be in Japan, for instance, if you're part of the Zen tradition, in my opinion, is much more based on how much social credibility you've established within the group, and very little to do with your actual progress with, for instance, meditative technique. And I've often called it Zen and the art of establishing my credibility within the group. And you get in Zen, as you get in other branches of Buddhism, you get this "we're not worthy" kind of attitude among the laity. We could never achieve enlightenment. Because only the great master such and such can do that kind of thing. Basically, what they call enlightenment to me is chillicity, or is a form of could be
stage one
form of chillicity. It's stage one, yeah. But they'll never get there because they're not worthy. They're sort of self-restricting. Remember what we said about the miasma. The miasma restricts people through self-policing. It gives them attitudes and things that make them feel not worthy, and it self-polices. And here we have it in Buddhism as well. And the people who are involved in those traditions, it's very much a social dimension. It's very much a miasmatic tradition. But that's not to say there isn't hidden within it shamanistic technique, but it wouldn't be the vast majority of people who are practicing that shamanistic technique in a shamanistic way. It wouldn't even be, you couldn't even go on the fact that somebody was very, very senior within a Zen tradition. Somebody seen as at the top levels of Zen tradition, you couldn't take that as an indicator that person would be practicing their technique in a shamanistic way. My experience of not just Zen, one of my areas of interest through my life has been, we talked about the Shinshukyo, the Japanese new religions, which have been
the folk religions, are they?
Founded by shamans. Most of them were founded by shamans in relatively modern times. We're talking about 19th century for most of them. And you have these same attitudes because cultural Buddhism is massively strong in Japan, and it has influenced these religions. Now, you could say some of those religions didn't have much Buddhist influence, or these originally shamanistic groups didn't have much Buddhist influence on when they first started off. But it didn't take long, just like it didn't take long for Christianity to influence esoteric groups within the West with increasing amounts of exotericism. It was exactly the same in Japan with Buddhism and with these Shinshukyo, these new, they call it translated as new religions, but they have the "we're not worthy" thing. Whereas when they first start off, some of these traditions, their founders and the very first generation of their founders' disciples were seen as bolshe, seen as disruptive by the Japanese government. They caused all sorts of mayhem. But if you look at just less than 100 years later, for a lot of them, if you look at their followers now, just the opposite. They are pillars of the Japanese community. They wouldn't be causing any trouble at all. And their explanation of why they can't do, and also most of them have stopped practicing shamanistic technique. There are a few exceptions. Those people who are those exceptions get frowned upon within those groups. Their explanation for why they're not practicing the shamanistic technique that the founder of their own group practiced and their disciples practiced is, we're not worthy, we're not great like those people were, we couldn't possibly do that ourselves. And a lot of these groups have actually have banned these techniques. As I said, that these groups were founded by shamans.
I can't even.
But they've actually.
I can't even contemplate
technique.
Why that. It just makes no sense.
Yeah,
it's crackers.
Well, it does from a social engineering point of view. It makes perfect sense because these things are about control, aren't they? They're about maintaining in this case.
It becomes like that, doesn't it? It becomes like that over time. I think you said once that in a certain folk religion that you know a lot about, it happened very, very quickly. This exotericism very quickly.
Yeah, within 20
decades,
years. 20 years of the death of the founder, yeah. Easily within 20 years, yeah. Quite
It's interesting how hierarchy creeps in, though. It's like... But it goes back to this concept that we've talked about shamanism on this podcast, and we've got to 28 episodes, and we've barely scratched the surface. Shamanism is one of those things that is so experientially based, you can't write it down in a book.
Yeah.
There's no way for somebody else to say, yes, you're doing it right, no, you're doing it wrong. You can have a discussion about it and you can infer from that some conclusions, but you can't directly get it. So when you come to these folk religions and it turns exoteric, is that just something that's natural because of this inability to get direct answers? And we're all about answers, aren't we? We want yes and no's. We want to put things in boxes.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Maybe we can record an end to this another time, but I've been invaded, so...
Okay, so we're back. We had a little bit of an interruption yesterday, but we are back, and we're going to try and finish this episode off. So, Damon, we were talking about the exoteric nature of the folk religions and how quickly they turned exoteric, and I was asking you why that was the case and whether that was to do with the fact that learning shamanism is so experientially based. You know, there's no rule book to say yes or no, you're getting it right, you're getting it wrong. I was just hoping to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of reasons. I guess first in terms of the size of the community, esotericism and shamanism are very, very difficult to teach or to convey to large numbers of people. The traditional shaman with the shaman's apprentice is kind of one-to-one, right? And when you're talking about the success of religions like Christianity and Buddhism and Islam and I guess you would say those religions that have become mass society religions in the world, they need to convey their teachings. Those religions need to convey their teachings not to one person but to millions of people, and so you have to baseline that. You have to give, rather than helping people along a path. A teacher of shamanism, as we've said before, is not a teacher. A teacher of shamanism is more of a guide.
It's really interesting. Sorry to interrupt, but it's like when you were teaching this to me and other people in our group, it was one of the most frustrating things because I'd always come to you with a question. And I'd always be like, Damon, I need an answer to this question. And you'd be like, well, Joseph, and you'd sort of stroke your beard, and it'd be a really kind of strange answer, and I'd have to go away and think about it for a long time. Because it was never the answer I was expecting, and it was never a yes or a no. It was never a categorical thing, which I always found really interesting and frustrating at the same time.
Yeah, the answer has to come from you, right? The answer doesn't come from your guide in, you know, if I was to create an exoteric religion, I could give you a bunch of things to believe, couldn't I? You know?
Yeah.
I think I could, you know, for instance, if I created an exoteric religion and I said that the universe was created out of a large rainbow, and the colours of the rainbow coalesced into the planets of the solar system, and that the most important colour in that process was blue, and that in order to achieve enlightenment, Joe, you should start wearing the colour blue and believing in the god of the blue sky. Then, you know, you can ask me that kind of question. What kind of colour should I wear? And I'll say, okay, wear blue because it represents the god of the blue sky, who was the most important of the, you know.
But then I take that and I go, right, I know where I sit now. Yes. I will wear blue.
You could extend.
Job done.
You could extend the idea because the people in the neighbouring state, they believe that the most important colour was orange, and I guess we could go to war.
Conflict.
We could go to war with them over that. Yeah. And it's this type of thing, you know. So you know, so in terms of the number of people, giving people a list of things to believe is a lot easier than giving people a bunch of activities that will enable them to gain knowledge and gain answers and gain understanding themselves from nature. And you know what I mean by understanding, you know, not just understanding in the mind, but understanding in the body and the spirit and the mind, all acting as one entity. So that's at one level. There's another level in which is related, which is when populations become large, people think that or believe that or seem to have the general idea that somebody needs to be in charge and somebody needs to sort out, to manage the population. And there are two ways of doing that. One is to...
Well, you cut people off from nature, can't you?
You can, yes.
You can put yourself in. You can put yourself as the authority to access God rather than God in a metaphorical sense.
That's kind of the clever way, but there's an even simpler way, which is, you know, that the first emperor, we talked about the Qin dynasty, the one that reunified China after the Warring States period, Spring and Autumn period. Those two periods are really the same thing, just a big period of turmoil in early China. We said a lot of the stuff that took off during that period, Confucianism, Taoism, this type of stuff. It was a really influential period for the initial kickoff of those movements, if you want to call them movements. And then we had the Han dynasty, where it was reunified by the Qin dynasty, and then the Han dynasty came along 400 years, contiguous with the Roman Empire. And then there was another disruptive period after that, during which Buddhism really took off. And so these periods of turmoil are where these things really get their impetus. But if you put yourself in the position of a ruler, you can do, there's a number of approaches you can take, but if you look at what Qin Shi Huangdi did in his approach, his approach was very much force. It was like, I'm the ruler of you guys, and in order to be reasonable, I'm going to spell out in detail what I expect of you as my subjects. Actually, you know, my slaves, effectively, if we're talking about guys like that, a lot of the subjects of the Emperor of China over many generations, when they're referring to even very high-ranking people, you know, you're talking about even the highest-ranking people in China, when they're talking to the emperor, they would refer to themselves as your slave. They would refer to themselves in the presence of the emperor as the emperor's slave, even though they're some of the most high-ranking people in China. Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of a unified China, if you like, he believed in this idea of a kind of spelling out in detail what he expects of his subjects, and if they do that, then fine. But if they don't do that, then the punishment was incredibly harsh. You know, people are probably aware that, you know, at certain periods in time in China, you'd have your head lopped off for next to nothing. But as far as he was concerned,
death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah, absolutely. But as far as he was concerned, it was like, look, I'm being reasonable. I've told you what I expect of you. I'm your ruler. Do you follow what I mean? And you've not done what I've told you, so you off with your head, kind of thing, you know. I'm sure there were so many rulers in the West who had a similar kind of attitude, you know. But this is only one way to control the population. And remember, Qin Shi Huangdi, and the Qin dynasty, they were very, very successful during the Warring States period, during a period of continual warfare. But when China was unified, after it was unified, and the peace came along, they were not very successful. That dynasty really didn't last very long at all, until it was overthrown by the Han. And actually, the very first guy the guy who led the Han or created the Han dynasty and overthrew it was actually a guy who transgressed one of those rules. He'd let some prisoners escape, you know, and he was obviously he'd had it, you know. He was going to had his head lopped off, so he legged it. He went and became a bandit and eventually overthrew them and founded a very long-lasting dynasty. But whereas the Qin just used the stick, you know, do what I tell you, or you've had it. He used the carrot and the stick. You know, you can say the carrot was like Confucianism. It was like, you guys, we're going to give you this belief system that revolves around our social structure, and you guys believe in it, and you do what you do to keep myself and my dynasty at the top of society. You do that because you believe that that's the correct social structure, and you believe in your place within that social structure. You're regulating yourself. You're policing yourself. To be fair, the Han used both approaches. You know, for those ones who didn't really believe that and didn't regulate themselves, they still had the Qin style stick ready, but they did, when they came to power, the Han did lessen a lot of the punishments. They did tone them down. I mean, they were still bad by modern standards, but by the standards of the day, the Han were thoroughly reasonable compared to what the Qin had been. And where the Qin had lasted next to no time, the Han lasted for 400 years. Yeah, so you can see that the self-policing mechanism in a settled, stable state is a lot more effective for population control. And again, this happened. You had this period of instability when Buddhism took off, and Buddhism then became a great mechanism, like Confucianism, became a great mechanism for population control, self-control of the population. And then later we got the Tang dynasty, which is another great period of stability within China. Stabilized not just by Confucianism, but also by Buddhism as well. And the stability of that huge population and that huge country has been maintained by these things, effectively Confucianism and Buddhism over that time, you know, arguably religious Taoism as well. Over that huge time span. And you know, the fact that does this stuff work, this exoteric stuff work in terms of its effectiveness for population control and stability of a country? Well, that country, as we've said before, that country has more history than any other. It has this great unbroken culture going back thousands of years. In terms of its effectiveness, I mean, this is irrespective of whether it's right or wrong or you know, from a shamanist point of view, it's all pretty unpleasant stuff, and it leads to people being a bit sheep-like, you know, and not experiencing the full richness and variety of life. But that's from a shamanistic point of view. From a ruler's point of view, Buddhism and Confucianism are awesome because it means I can use my armies to fight other people. I don't have to control my population. They're controlling them themselves. And, you know, Buddhism and Confucianism fulfilled this important role from a ruler's point of view in the Far East, in the same way that Christianity fulfilled that role in Europe. Yeah. So that's a couple of reasons why exotericism takes off in terms of large populations. But also, from another point of view, it's just easier. It's easier to pick up and learn exoteric religion. Remember, when you're picking up exoteric religion in the world, usually you're a very young age and you're picking it up off your parents. Yeah. Picking up shamanism at a very young age that's a tall ask. I mean, it's possible, but it's a tall ask because of the demands of becoming a shaman. They're very, very high. The bar is high. It's a tough thing. It's a really, really tough thing. And there's a lot of effort has to go into that. And, even within animistic societies, not everybody becomes a shaman because it is such a tough thing. And they have it easier than people in settled societies in terms of picking it up and understanding what it's about. And so from that point of view, just from the easiness, do we have to have this shamanism stuff? It's so difficult. Why don't we just start believing stuff? There's that aspect as well,
So if we were to zoom out and give an overview as to perhaps why we're discussing Buddhism here.
Yeah.
We're warning people who are into shamanism against perhaps the path that Buddhism can lead you down. Would that be a correct assumption?
It's not so much that. I mean, a warning perhaps in terms of you're right what you said before in terms of there is a perception that that these Eastern spiritual traditions are a path towards understanding. They may well be a path towards a certain type of understanding, but they're not necessarily paths towards shamanistic understanding. So what I'm saying is when we come on to discuss other aspects of shamanism in terms of how shamanism has embedded itself within these traditions, it's more like understanding what these traditions themselves are based on so that you can subtract that from the traditions that are handed down within Mongolia, within China, within Tibet, within Japan. I guess we say a list of countries, Korea, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Burma,
Even just from a little bit of experience and understanding from shamanism, I could see what various how shall I say, exoteric religion, the teachings from those religions were trying to say or trying to convey. Quite easily, actually. It's not actually that hard. Certain religions you have to dig a little bit deeper, but others, it's just there staring in your face. It's just, it's just obviously...
And you know that, over time, one of the things we mentioned there is that some of the, the Shinshu-kyo, these what people call religions, I mean, they weren't really religions when they were founded, but they rapidly became that. And there were a lot of them starting in sort of 19th century Japan. There were a lot of them. Again, there was a lot of turmoil at the end of Tokugawa period in Japan when Japan had been ruled by shoguns, military generalissimos or dictators for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then all of a sudden that was gone. And replaced those sort of power vacuum. There was a lot of turmoil at the end of that period. And again, this is this turmoil period when these shamanistic groups started arising in Japan, and there's lots of them. You think Konko-kyo, Tenri-kyo that we've mentioned before. There's a lot of these kind of organizations grew up during that time period. They rapidly became exotericized, but you got to remember they were growing up inside a country that had a long tradition of Buddhism, and not just any other kind of Buddhism. Japan was at the extreme exoteric end, so the distinctions are made in Buddhism in terms of different types of Buddhism. And, to me, these kind of distinctions are not really very important, but you can say that different types of Buddhism lie at different positions on a sort of shades of grey towards unbelievable levels of exotericism at one end and a sort of esoteric leaning at the other end. So the sort of more esoteric leaning branches. So
if somebody wanted to explore one of the more esoteric leaning branches, could you direct them where to look?
Yeah, Mongolia. We already mentioned it before. Mongolia, Tibet, yeah. But the point I was trying to make in terms of these distinctions that people make about different types of Buddhism is with those shamanistic groups growing up in Japan, the particular flavor of Buddhism that was popular in Japan at that time and had been for a long time is one called Mahayana Buddhism. And that type of Buddhism was way out there on the extreme exoteric end of Buddhism, to the point where the original ideas that, life's about suffering, something can be done about it, and there's an eightfold path towards enlightenment, this type of thing that the historical Buddha kind of came up with or formulated out of the Brahmin tradition. That kind of thing had extra layers of stuff heaped on top of it, exoteric stuff. I mean, for instance, the ideal of the Bodhisattva. So, there's this concept that somebody can achieve nirvana, enlightenment, and break out of the eternal cycle of samsara, the ongoing cycle of rebirth, by quashing all that desire and attachment that's inside them. They heaped another layer on top of that, so now there are these guys called bodhisattvas who can achieve enlightenment, but then they choose not to break out of samsara in order to have compassion and to help other people move towards enlightenment. It's what I call it's like salvation by proxy, and then you go even further. Certain Buddhist groups in Japan who ended up in a place where the Buddhism has sutras, which are the Buddhist law, and people read these sutras, and they would explain the Dharma, the law, and the historical Buddha, and over time more and more sutras were accumulated, and a lot of these ideas, these increasing amounts of exotericism, were embedded into more and more sutras, some of these extreme end exoteric groups started thinking, well, I don't even have to read the sutra. All I have to do is believe in it and I will be saved, kind of thing. So you get them chanting chants like Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, for instance, a chant in English, it would be something like, I worship the wonderful law of the Lotus Sutra, yeah? And you just chant that over and over again, and you gain good karma, you gain, you move forwards in life, and you move forwards in your spiritual tradition simply by chanting the fact that this sutra is wonderful. You can gain positive karma without actually reading the thing, let alone understanding what it's saying, So my point is that the context in which these shamanistic groups appeared in 19th century Japan was this heavy, exoteric Mahayana type of Buddhism. It wasn't the sort of Buddhism, the slightly less exoteric type of Vajrayana Buddhism that you get in say, Mongolia or Tibet, or even the Theravada Buddhism that you would get in, originally in India, but, nowadays it would be Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, those sort of places. So these shamans appeared within a heavily exoteric framework, and their initial groups of students were deeply steeped in Mahayana Buddhist law, and so they felt uncomfortable with what they were being taught, I guess, and they started to adapt it to make themselves feel more comfortable based on their upbringing since children, which had been a Mahayana Buddhist upbringing on the whole.
Very strict, like this is this, that is that.
Yeah, and that's not to say there aren't interesting things in Mahayana Buddhism, but, the thing, I mean, again, Mahayana Buddhism was more successful than any of the other flavors in terms of, the most exoteric flavor of Buddhism was also the one, guess what, with the most followers.
Yeah.
I mean, they had China, that's kind of where, when Buddhism was at its height, they had the most followers, China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam had a lot of Mahayana Buddhism, and so the numbers of followers in the other places, so the other types of Buddhism, still exoteric but slightly less exoteric, small in number in comparison, and of course, just like Christianity, what's really, really interesting from a historical point of view is how spectacularly unsuccessful Buddhism was in its homeland in India, and how spectacularly unsuccessful Christianity was in its homeland in what we would call the Holy Land. These two great world religions have this in common. They're spectacularly successful in foreign lands and spectacularly unsuccessful in the place where they came from,
So that would be because everybody where they're from, people would have their own complete miasma, and it would be a perversion into that. But
absolutely,
when they took their religion to other places, they had their opportunity to exercise the whole going after the leaders, going after spreading it.
And in Tibet, of course, there's Bon, which is the native Tibetan religion. which is a bit like Shinto in Japan. It was a more exoteric outgrowth of an original shamanistic tradition, and so Bon in Tibet is heavily enmeshed with the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition at an early date, and of course Mongolia got its Buddhism from Japan. So when we talk about, Mongolia had its own native shamanism, but it also imported Buddhism from Tibet, and that Buddhism that it imported from Tibet had Tibetan-born, an outgrowth of Tibetan shamanism embedded within it. So Mongolia effectively had two major shamanic traditions that were imported.
So go to Mongolia.
I'd go into Mongolia, dress warm, especially if you're going in the winter. But, when we talk about Mongolia, we have to take into account communism again. We said, Buddhism and communism were major imports, had major impact on China, while Buddhism and communism had major impact on Mongolia as well. But the difference is, of course, China had its own homegrown communism, whereas Mongolia imported very much Soviet communism, very Stalinist type of communism, So go to Mongolia and see what survived. But the same with China, the same in Mongolia. Is
it still a communist?
No, absolutely not. After Russia ceased to be, the Soviet Union started falling apart, and the Warsaw Pact started falling apart in terms of losing communism. Mongolia was after Russia, it was the first one to become communist. It was also the first one to stop being communist.
They thought, hey, we're not having any of this.
After Russia, yeah. So effectively, they followed Russians' lead in both directions. The really, really interesting thing, or one of the really funny things about democracy, Mongolia became a democracy very quickly after the fall of communism in Russia and the fall of communism in Mongolia. But the great quote from, I think the first democratically elected president of Mongolia was a guy called Ochabat. President Ochabat was interviewed by the press about what democracy meant for Mongolia, and he says, well, we have to find out what it is first. I thought that was very funny, This is after having been democratically elected. One of his first statements was, let's best find out what democracy is before we start making pronouncements about it. I thought that was so honest. And, one of the things I've always liked about Mongols, they are so honest, those people, lovely, lovely people. But, when I'm talking about Mongolia, when I talk about Mongolia, I'm talking about what people would call Outer Mongolia. That's the independent country of Mongolia. I'm not talking about Inner Mongolia, which is a region of China. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that's been a fascinating historical-based episode with lots of background information, I guess, with some nice interplay between Buddhism and shamanism. So,
yeah.
We'll call it a do there, but next episode, I think, should we revisit the 8 trigrams for an episode?
Yeah, why not? I mean, we want to get into the 64 hexagrams at some point, so we could start moving in that direction.
It's going to take us years at this rate, isn't it? We need to try and get this back up and running.
Well, yeah, I think we need to it's going to take us years at any rate, even if we're doing one a week. But I think we can use this new episode.
I have been receiving a lot of emails. People going like, "Where are the episodes? What are you doing?"
Well, that's great. Joe, it's great that people want to hear what we've got to say. I'm really grateful, to be honest. Really grateful to those people.
It's shocking to me as well. It is quite surprising, but it is very humbling. So we will be continuing these episodes, and we will do them. One promise that we can say is we'll do them when we can, and we'll hopefully get back to one a week at some point. Go to wovenenergy.com for your Get Started episode. You can pop your email address and get on the email list. And I think, I was saying in the emails, I have received quite a few emails of people asking questions as well. So maybe we can just do one question at the beginning of an episode and sort of see if we can plough through them.
Or we could do another one of those mini ones and answer a few questions,
Yeah, we could do that.
Yeah. Awesome, mate.
Right then, thanks a lot, guys, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks a lot. Bye.